Good evening, everybody. I'm going to run you through our Active Travel Café running order for this evening. It's slightly different because we're moving things around a bit. So Mark, the Ranty Highwayman, is with us, but has to dash off shortly, don't you, Mark? So you're going to go first with your contribution. Then we're going to do our crowdsourced news roundup from all over the British Isles. And then we're going to Alice Roberts from CPRE for our main presentation this afternoon. So that's the running order. Mark, news, Alice is what we're doing. That's the roundup. So thank you in advance to all our speakers. Thank you so much for taking time, and Alice, really lovely to have you with us. So without further ado, I'm going to invite you, Mark, to kick us off. I know you've got some slides to share.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Apologies for messing the running order, but I'm dashing off to give a lecture straight after this. So bear with me. Might have a couple of minutes for questions. Let's see how we go. So probably helpfully to set the theme for a bit later, I'm going to talk about area parking management. You don't need a permit to park a horse outside a chip shop. I was looking for a nice, interesting photo to start us with. So let's get into a few wordy slides, I'm afraid, to start with. But I'll blast through those and get to the ones with photos to give you a few examples of a few things. So I think it's important to set the scene on this with car parking, and that goes for loading and lorry parking, anything else. The starting position is you can kind of do what you like unless you're otherwise prohibited by national or local rules. Which means in many cases we've quite often got a free-for-all going on, which then has the impact of we having to spend money and time and effort to try and deal with these problems. And to do with that, generally speaking, we're using traffic regulation orders or traffic management orders in London, just to be different. And with that, there's a statutory process, and if we've been really pure about it, that statutory process only has to consider written objections. And that's often from people who drive and want to park their vehicles without restriction. So almost from the off, the playing field is very, very unlevel. So status quo, very hard to shift in many ways. From an area-wide approach, we can consider the bigger picture and hopefully build in a bit of efficiency to the process. And that's what we're going to look at tonight, just a quick blast through area-wide approaches. So why would we want to manage car parking over an area? So we've got problems with demand outstripping supply, and that's creating safety issues, blockages, antisocial parking, all the things that everyone knows around. Residents might complain they can't park near their homes, especially around railway stations, which is a classic. Shopping centres, high streets, any attractor of driven trips. And maybe if everything's dealt with in an area consistently, it's a bit easier to enforce. Especially if you've got controls going on all day. The enforcement officers don't have to target a particular area. They can just go out anytime and see what's going on. We might also want to align with other policies, so curbside management more generally, and that could bring into things around pocket parks, urban drainage systems, all that kind of thing. We've also got destination parking being managed. So if we don't provide lots of places to park at a destination, we can kind of manage traffic flows, because it's pointless driving somewhere if you can't park there. We might also want to be prioritising blue badge holders or prioritising for servicing and loading. Little glossary here, I'm going to talk about waiting restrictions, and that's essentially yellow lines and yellow signs, and they vary with different types of area-wide approach. I should talk about loading restrictions, which are yellow blips on the curbs and or little white traffic signs. And when I say at any time, that means all the time, 24/7. So let's look at the three ways to manage car parking over an area. We have controlled parking zones, referred to as CPZs, restricted parking zones, referred to as RPZs, and permit parking areas, referred to as PPAs. And I'm going to spend the second half of this quick blast through looking at those three. So with controlled parking zones, we will have a signed entry and exit point, and here's an entrance sign on the right hand side here. We can use waiting and loading restrictions within that zone. We mark and sign the parking bays within, including the paid for parking bays. The advantage is, let me just flip back here to give the example. One of the advantages is, so if we do have on the controlled zone entry sign, you've got there Monday to Saturday, 8:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. The beauty of it is that where we put the single yellow line in that depicts that restriction time, we don't actually need to put up lots of little yellow sign plates everywhere. So it declutters the street a bit. We only have to sign the individual bays. So that's the best way of doing it when the signs match the parking restrictions. You can vary it, but then you add the signs in and you're kind of wasting your time having a controlled parking zone. One of the issues is if the zone is too big, drivers might very quickly forget what they've read on the sign as they go in. I personally would have the same time of operation on the parking bays as I would the zone, as I would the yellow lines. Just makes things very, very easy for people to keep it simple and consistent. On the right-hand side, there is the zone entry sign, zone exit sign, so people know they've left the zone. You can go from one zone to another. Again, it can get messy with different times. So simplicity, consistency, that's my advice there. Certainly where I live, we have zones that operate at different times of the day. So that part of the borough is an hour in the morning, that part of the borough is now at lunchtime, that part of the borough is now in the afternoon. That's designed to disrupt commuter parking whilst trying to make it as easy as possible for everybody else to park, residents or visitors outside those hours. And also the enforcement people go, well, they're in the morning, they're at lunchtime, they're in the afternoon. Personally, I'd make all three of them the same time, all day, and maybe have some visitor parking or some pay and display parking within. But there you go, different policies in different areas. Permit parking areas, fairly similar, but probably on a much smaller scale. So we again have the signed entry and exit points, best used in small cul-de-sacs or groups of streets. Popular where you've got event parking and things don't happen the same time every day. So round stadiums is a classic. I was up in Brent recently, and round Wembley Stadium, there's these permit parking areas that literally they're brought into force whenever there's an event on at the stadium, and the signs are folded out. Some signs will say on match days, which is a bit difficult if you don't actually know when the match days are, but there you go, different ways of doing it. What's also really good is you don't have to provide any bay markings. So actually, you put the sign in as you go in. You don't have to, but it's useful to have repeater signs every so often. If it's one cul-de-sac, you don't really. If it's a bit bigger, then it's good practice to have a few of these optional repeater signs, but very, very cheap in terms of installation and maintenance. You can add other waiting and loading restrictions. So for example, you might have this small group of streets with a permit parking area, and you want to put double yellow lines on all the junctions. That's absolutely fine, and that affects everybody. You can't park on the yellow lines even if you have a permit. So quite a neat, useful way of kind of doing a cut down CPZ. Probably not useful for a massive town centre because again, we do have to make things easy for the driver, and this is not really aimed at that situation. Let's look at the third type then, which is restricted parking zones. Entry sign on the right hand side there. They were originally developed for historic areas where yellow lines would be intrusive, and you used to have to get special authorization from the Department of Transport for putting these things in. No longer need that, so it's very, very similar to the controlled parking zone. We have the sign entry and exit points. We can be very simple with no waiting or loading except in sign bays. So the example on the right hand side would say you can't park in there unless you're actually parking in the right bay at the right time, and that's what that red circle with the slash through it means. That's essentially your no parking sign. You have to have your waiting and loading restrictions uniform within the zone. So anything that appears on this sign has to appear within the entire zone, and it must use repeater signs. So we don't have yellow lines of any kind. We don't have any blips of any kind, but we do have these yellow signs, which is your effectively your yellow lines. and your no loading signs, which is effectively your curb blips. But you have to have these as extra clutter, but you don't have to have the stuff on the ground. It's really useful if you've got cobbles or historic materials that don't take the paint and would look horrible. And the best ones actually will take these signs and try and attach them to the buildings if possible. So here we go. Bays don't need to be painted. This one here actually is picked out by this. You can just see the different block paving outside this set of gates. Very subtle sign attached to the building. So loading takes place to the right of that sign, and there'll be a twin of that further up saying to the left of that sign. So we can use materials, bollards, but we do need those bay signs. Final slide from me. So this is from chapter 3 of the traffic signs manual, which says that RPZs are not suitable for through routes of heavy traffic or facilities which create a demand for parking greater than can be accommodated in the on-street bays and any convenient off-street parking. Well, here's an A road with lots of through routes with an RPZ applied to it in the High Street Hornchurch. You can't stop. If you stop in the carriageway, you can block everything. So picked out on the edge there, that's actually a loading bay. Small element paving versus big slabs. So it can be done, doesn't say you can't do it, just says you probably shouldn't, but you know, designers can push envelope. And there you go, Steve. Thank you very much.
Mark, that was brilliant, comprehensive. We're all now experts in about 12 minutes. That was amazing. Thank you so much. So very briefly, because I'm conscious it's a bit of an odd one, we're coming back to parking with Alice, so we could just pile into parking in a big way now. But has anybody got any questions or thoughts about Mark's contribution there? And we have one question in the chat, which is about how do we get something like the Dutch where it's only allowed in designated areas. Any thoughts on that, Mark?
Yes, but we can't. So the only way you could do that is with RPZs. If you were going to apply an RPZ across the entire town, for example, that could be problematic. Just again, we're going back to driver confusion, aren't we? We have to spoon feed people. However, I would say an RPZ over a town area is probably better than a CPZ, because at least with the RPZ, you have all the repeater signs within the zone, which should make it a lot easier for drivers. The guidance doesn't say you can't do it, just says you probably shouldn't. So push the guidance.
Brilliant. And we have, there's another question in the chat. I'm just getting it up on screen. Apologies if this covered already, coming in late. Views on CPZ zone size versus whole borough Roma. How big should a zone be? I think you have covered that a bit, Mark, but do you want to just cover it very briefly again?
Oh, I don't think there's a set size, because every time you try and do a CPZ, there's always a fringe issue in how far do you go. There's always a group of people that say it's not a problem until you put it in, that it is a problem. I don't think there's any actual guidance on the size, but maybe if you're doing like an LTN up to 1,000 meters by 1,000 meters, possibly something like that. But it depends. I mean, if your town has got the same problems across it, maybe do it on a larger scale. But the problem with CPZs is once somebody drives in there, it doesn't take long for somebody to forget what the time of operation is. And that's not because drivers are bad at remembering, that's because people are bad at remembering. So don't make it so big that people are, they're trying to drive around here and think about what's happening. They need to be able to work out what they're doing.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark. Right. Any other points to Mark before we let you dash off to your other busy evening stuff? No? Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Mark. That was amazing.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Cheers. Have a good one. See you next week. And so we're now going to go into our crowdsourced news roundup, starting with breaking news from Roger Geffron from Cycling UK. Roger, can I come straight to you first, and then we'll take other bits of news from around the UK, but you go first.
Great. Well, thanks, Steve. Firstly, actually, I should clarify. I should probably change my little name tag on the display, because actually most of this update is wearing my Transport Action Network hat rather than my Cycling UK hat. So the main bit of news to relay was in the Guardian yesterday. I hope you picked up on it, that Transport Action Network is bringing a legal challenge to the government's decision made in early March to cut the funding for cycling walking investment. the gist of the argument is that there is a cycling walking investment strategy isn't just a nice thing to have. There is a legal requirement that, with my Cycling UK hat on, we and others pushed for back in 2015. That legislation requires the government to set a cycling walking investment strategy and periodically review it. But in setting or varying a cycling walking investment strategy, well, firstly, a CWIS has to set out objectives to be achieved and funding and financial resources to be made available by the Secretary of State for the purpose of achieving those objectives. Unfortunately, it doesn't say that the finances have to be sufficient to meet the objectives. However, when they reduced the financial resources, we were able to say, as part of a legal argument, as I say, we now being Transport Action Network, we were able to say that the government has not complied with the statutory process. If they want to vary a CWIS, they have to do that by consulting, and in doing so, the law also requires them to have regard to the stability of cycling walking investment strategies. And we've argued, we've made a submission that they haven't done that. So we've got a crowdfunder out there. Thank you to anyone here who has already contributed. Where we've got to £9 on day one. We need to get 15 grand to get the case started. It's probably going to be more like 40 grand if we actually have to see the case right through. Initial signs from the government is that they are kind of, well, they're not fully raising white flags, and anyway, I'm not quite sure how much I should be saying about this, but they're not looking like they are minded to fight us, which I'm kind of treating as a bit of a sign that they recognise that they're on hiding to nothing on this one. Well, thank you for posting that. So we're up to 11k now, but contributions gratefully received. Thank you, Adam, for posting that. No doubt more news to follow on that one. A related news story is that tomorrow the National Audit Office will be publishing its findings of a review of effectively the cost effectiveness of the government's investment in active travel. Again, I need to avoid too much of a spoiler alert, but I don't think you'll be too disappointed by what they're saying. The risk, of course, is that although the NAO is going to be saying helpful things, there are sections of the media who might try and spin it the other way, that cycling walking investment hasn't worked, it's failed to meet its targets, therefore it's a terrible waste, therefore cut it, therefore cut active travel England. And of course, we're having to pull the stops out to try and make sure the media get the other message, that it's the underfunding and the lack of consistent funding that is the reason why we're still failing to meet our targets. So if you see any of the wrong messaging coming out in any of your local media, then please help kind of turn the narrative around towards the right one. Last update, and this also relates to it, clearly there is a wider point with the underfunding of active travel. In theory, the government could decide that, well, the funding is too limited, we just can't afford to pay for this active travel stuff, therefore we're going to reduce the objectives to be achieved, we're going to cut down on the targets, if you like. That too would be varying a CWIS, so they still have to consult on that, and we'll argue that they still need to publish the evidence as to what funding is needed to meet their targets. That's all for the future, but even if they reduce their objectives to be achieved, the upshot of that is that means they're further away from meeting other wider objectives, for instance, on their net zero strategy and their air quality targets. So you can see that it's kind of like a kind of Jenga piece, that if you pull it out, then a whole load of other things come crashing down. Related to that is that the government is still long overdue to publish its guidance to local authorities on how to write their new local transport plans, and a quick reminder for that we're expecting this government guidance. It was supposed to have come out last January, not as in 18 months ago, not 5 months ago. It's a very, very long overdue. We were expecting the government guidance to say the local transport plans to be adopted by all English transport authorities outside London need to include a cycling walking strategy, a bus strategy, crucially, some quantified carbon reduction targets. We need the guidance as to how they're going to do that. So again, with my Transport Action Network hat on, we're arranging a series of briefing events around the country, 5 events. I'll pop the email to to the list of events. There's one in Birmingham. They're basically northwest, northeast, southwest, southeast, and central. Series of 5 events from mid-June to one in September. Do come and find out how you can influence your local transport plan, working with people with other interests, whether they're cycle campaigners, walking campaigners, clean air campaigners, safer streets campaigners, low car dependence campaigners, whatever they are. We want to bring people together to brief them on the opportunity of local transport plans. And I'll pop a link to those events in the chat. Okay, that's me.
Brilliant. Thanks, Roger. I think there was about 5 things there. We've got quite a to-do list from your update there. So support the crowdfund, and well done, Roger. I mean, brilliant work, obviously. But yeah, support their crowdfunder. Keep an eye on the media so that we can all fight back against disinformation and untruth. And then those events sound great, Roger. I'm really interested for the Northwest in terms of that decarbonisation pathway and how we tie that together with our local transport plans. Brilliant. Great. I've got lots of hands up, so people either coming back on some of that or their own news updates. Mark in Liverpool, I'm going to go to you first.
Thanks, because I've got a train in about 15 minutes, and you can see the Liverpool perforated cycle track right behind me. Just to say that we're now starting work on what Roger said, by the way, about advice to local authorities. One of the things that accompanied that was that there was a statement saying that every local authority in the country has either got an LC whip or has started one, which is possibly slightly disingenuous. But we're probably doing one of the very last councils that have started one, which is Thurrock, the rather unprepossessing council to the east of London, which has the Lower Thames crossing in it, which Roger would possibly want to talk about at some other point. So that's one of the very last ones, I think, that's being started. We had the regional stakeholders last week. So if anyone does live in that bit of southeast Essex, it would be interesting to hear from them.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark. Don't miss your train. And I'm sure the good people of Thurrock might take slight objection. I bet it's a lovely place.
Oh, it's great, but it's very car dominated.
Yeah, well, it can. Yeah, there's a few of those. Right, I'm going to come to David next. David Sullivan, over to you.
Hi, yeah, right. This week was the Hearts Active Travel Forum, which was just around the corner from where I live in Hatfield. So I sort of asked if they could give me a ticket, and they gave me a free ticket. It was fairly well attended, mostly a lot of campaigners, a lot of councillors. There was an interesting session from a councillor in Watford who seemed very on the ball, talking about what they're doing over there. I also went to a workshop about use of rights of way and what they might play in active travel. And they also ran sessions on healthy streets, on how to get the message across and things like that. This is all part of their launch in their draft active travel strategy consultation, which I'll put a link to in the chat. It's all quite interesting, all very positive. It's a shame there just weren't a few more councillors there, but the people who were there were all very collaborative, all sort of working hard. I was slightly, I've never been to one of these events before, so I was a bit unsure how it would be going in, but literally the councillors from all the different parties that were there, all very positive, all want to do the right thing, but they don't necessarily all know how to do the right thing, if that makes sense. Anyway, that's it for me.
Brilliant. David, sounds like a very positive thing. That's really good, really good. Thank you so much. All right, Adam, over to you, and then I'll come to you, Stuart, in Colchester.
Yeah, my FOI asking Active Travel England whether or not Mark Harper had actually told Active Travel England to drop all the low traffic neighbourhood schemes from Active Travel for Tranche 4. The statements come back from Active Travel England said they have no record of the minister giving them that instruction, so that may be useful. I've put the link through to the FOI there. The other thing that's I've got here is some ATF tranche for analysis. Active Travel England were really strict on what they were doing. I'll just post it all into the there. It's all gone in into the chat. Basically, if you had an IMD and indices of multiple deprivation score of 4, you got 52% of all of the funding. So it was very, very clear that Active Travel England were very much pushing the money towards some of the more deprived areas. That could be useful. Also, I thought was quite interesting is the Southeast didn't do too well. Now, I'm assuming this excludes London, but maybe there could be some sort of political analysis that could be done. But anyway, it's there for you to all have a look at, enjoy.
Brilliant, thanks, Adam. Yes, I'm sure very useful, and many of us might find that FOI particularly useful. Brilliant stuff. Stuart, can I come to you in Colchester?
Sure, thank you. So disappointing news from Colchester. Essex County Council has shelved the key part of the £4 million Active Travel Fund Tranche 2 scheme. So everyone's talking about Tranche 4 and bids for that. We were still going to get the £4 million of Tranche 2 spent in Colchester, and Essex County Council have suspended that and shelved it. So we've asked to see the cabinet member and see how much money is left out of the £4 million after nearly 3 years now since they originally bid. So we worry how much has gone in consultation and design work, and trying to work with the council to rescue something from whatever is left. So sad news from Essex there.
Yeah, they said bad luck, Stuart, and good luck with the cabinet member. We're all there in spirit with you.
Thank you.
So being crammed into the room, being vaguely threatening. Right, brilliant. I think that's all of our local roundup. I've just got a bit of news from Greater Manchester, which is we had our 5th Big Active Conversation event this week, and I was lucky enough to be on a panel with Dame Sarah Story, where she announced that Greater Manchester is adopting Vision Zero. And so that is now going to be guiding all of our plans, which is very exciting. Okay, so that's our news roundup from around the UK, which means we can now come to Alex Roberts from CPRE, Campaign for the Protection of Rural England, in London. And Alice, I'll hand over to you to talk through your new parking assessment tool and what you've been up to.
Hi, thanks very much. So yeah, I'm Alice Roberts, CPRE London. So I'm London based, I campaign around London. I'm also the coordinator or chair, if you like, of the London Borough's Healthy Streets scorecard, which I can see Simon's here, so also involved in that. And yeah, so I started talking about parking because it kind of falls between the gaps of what everybody else talks about often. So obviously, if you're a cycling campaigner or pedestrian campaigner, you're not necessarily specifically talking about parking. So it kind of started with that, but it also had a lot to do with space. And in London, space, obviously everywhere, space is at a premium, but in London in particular. But yeah, I have been outside London occasionally, so I do talk about spaces outside London too. And hopefully in my presentation you'll see some examples of things that are outside of London. So I'm just going to get my slideshow up. So hopefully you can all see that. Slideshow.
Yep, oh, that's great.
Yep.
Alice.
Are we good?
Brilliant.
So it's quite a long presentation, but what I always say to people is it's up on our website. You'll have the link, and it's really here for people to dip. You know, I'm giving you the overview, and then you can come back to it. So bits of it might be more interesting for you than others. And I'm going to try to, you know, make those links with Active Travel as much as possible. Every time I do this presentation, I add in something different, something else has happened that I want to put in. This week it's my Stevenage, my map of Stevenage's surface car parks, which, if anybody have seen you, I'm Clapton Alice on Twitter. So I've been tweeting it as much as possible, just because I'm trying to ram home a message here. So that's new. So anybody who's, hopefully not too many of you have seen my presentation already, but if you have, that's new, right? So I'm just going to crack on. So this is my my parklet outside my house in Hackney in London. Very pleased with that. Right, so this publication is intended for just get rid of that, for anyone really who has an interest in how parking relates to urban planning or promoting a better urban environment generally. We've just launched a parking action tool, and it's really a summary of there's a summary there of everything that we think that local authorities should be thinking about in relation to parking policy. So the contents of this, I'm not going to go through them, but this is for when you come back to it if you're looking for certain things. So why does parking matter? So parking matters because Every car journey starts and ends in a parking space. If it's unrestricted, people drive more. That obviously leads to all kinds of unpleasant impacts, unwanted impacts. So it takes up an enormous amount of space, and a lot of that space is public realm, urban realm. And some of its historic settings, town centres, and all of that can be dramatically improved through action on parking. Something like, there's some statistic which says that 80% of London's public realm is streets and parking. So here's a bit of a summary. London takes up, sorry, this is a bit London focused, but you know, obviously you can translate it to elsewhere. Takes up a huge amount of space, has big impact on road safety as well. If it's not restricted, your sight lines are not good, and so forth. More people walk, fewer people walk, sorry, more people use their car, fewer people walk and cycle. And a disproportionate amount of space, public space, is given to cars, and that's just plain unfair when a lot of people don't have cars, particularly in London. Huge proportion of householders don't have access to a car. So parking matters for lots of reasons: traffic, health, freeing up space to tackle deficiency of green space. Need for green infrastructure now is increasing, obviously, massively. We need safe streets. We need to deliver economic recovery, and we need to save our countryside, which is something I'm going to talk a bit about at the beginning. So time for change. Why is it time for change? Well, it's one of the most important tools that councils have that they can use. It doesn't cost a huge amount of money, if anything, and sometimes it makes money, but we've noticed very low ambition in using parking policy to tackle the very serious issues that we face. This is one indicator, it's just one indicator of London boroughs, controlled parking in London boroughs, and the proportion of streets that are where parking is controlled. And it just shows the huge variation there, even within the inner London boroughs, which you can see in light blue. So that's just one indicator, but we do see a huge variation in what councils are doing, and that's, yeah, so one reason we need to take action. Local authority powers. I think people often talk about controlled parking, but they forget about everything else. So local highway, and it's local highway and traffic authority. So that is about controlling parking. Councils are managers of housing estates often, where they can control parking, but often don't. They are the owners and operators of public car parks often. They're the local planning authorities, which sets the parking levels for new housing. And they can enable development or redevelopment of surface car parks, or indeed multi-storey car parks. They are the local transport authority with powers to plan for sustainable transport, or possibly introduce a local workplace parking levy. And they are an employer with workplace parking, and they can show leadership by restricting parking in council offices, including schools, all other public places like that. So just want to go straight to land use planning and sustainable transport, sustainable patterns of development. This is really at the heart of absolutely everything. Appropriate local plan. You need appropriate planning policies, obviously. The suitable density. If you want a bus service to run financially, you need to have over about 100 dwellings per hectare, certainly not below 60. If you can set your parking standards, councils should adopt car-free housing. Obviously, everybody outside of London will gasp and say it's impossible, but that's obviously where we need to be heading. And councils in their local plans need to be actively promoting the redevelopment of not just surface car parks, but big box retail. So we need to look at sustainable patterns of development and not ones which are promoting car use. So that's your kind of summary. Compact cities often with a green belt will be low carbon. Public transport is more financially viable and they're more active and healthy, whereas urban sprawl gives you the opposite, basically. So this is my new map of Stevenage. I'm very pleased with this. My new map of Stevenage's surface car parks. So these are just their surface car parks. There are multi-storey ones as well. and I've given you the kind of bigger picture of Stevenage there as well on the right, and that is to show you that in fact you can pretty much cycle from one end of Stevenage to the other in 15-20 minutes. And of course Stevenage has built-in safe cycling infrastructure off-road, and yet nobody uses it. And why do they not use it? Well, there's your answer. So why are we building? This is the what's it called now? I can't remember. Oh, sorry. Horton Regis. Is it Horton Regis development near to Dunstable? So what I've done there is shown you what's going on. So they're building urban fringe development at 30 to 40 dwellings per hectare, which is essentially super low density. Their car parking standards are up at probably 2 per household. That's shown in orange, and then there you have all their surface car parks shown in pink there. It's not quite as bad as Stevenage, but there is a lot there. So yeah, what I'm saying is that if you don't get this right, you're just on a hiding to nothing. So I just want to quickly show you what density looks like, and density on the left, that's 25 dwellings per hectare, but surprisingly perhaps on the right you've got something like 70 dwellings per hectare, and that's just a terrace street. So I'm not talking about tower blocks, I'm just talking about getting the density right. So this is your surface car park big box retail. This is on the A10 in North London in Enfield, and on the left is a picture of what is being proposed for that space. So high density development, mixed use. Parking standards, I've put in there London's parking standards. So the London plan promotes car-free development, as probably many of you know. That's just there as an example. Obviously what I hear all the time is but local parking standards state a minimum of whatever it is, 1.5 per household, or 2 often, or 2.5. I also hear, but London's different, it has good public transport. So I mean, my answer to this is, well, we need to eliminate minimum parking standards, and yes, it is a chicken and egg problem with public transport, but obviously we do have to start somewhere. Otherwise we're simply perpetuating unsustainable patterns of development. So moving on, the starting point for parking policy is obviously the road user hierarchy. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. We would advocate audits, so developing a parking policy which supports your environment, health, social goals will mean starting with good information. Every 4 to 5 years, as an example there, Westminster conducts an in-depth occupancy survey, and obviously if you don't have controlled parking it's a bit harder, but that is really important. Obviously Lambeth conducted a curbside audit prior to it developing its curbside strategy, which many of you will know about. Charges, so this is what we say about charges. Again, there's quite a lot of detail here. No permit should be below £150 a year. Parking charges should be differentiated. No cycle hanger rental should be more than 1/6 of the cost of the cheapest car parking permit. No short stay parking should be less than the cost of a return bus ticket. So that's what we would advocate. I don't know if everybody knows, but boroughs are required to publish parking reports. Sorry, that just says which, so I'll go on to this one, which does show your report. So it shows a lot of information, including finances, which can be really helpful, as it shows if there's a surplus which can be spent on active travel infrastructure. So have a little look about for that, or ask your council for it if you think that's relevant. Sorry, I've set out here in 3 slides, which I'm not going to go into in detail, what you can spend it on. So that's the section of the Road Traffic Regulation Act. If you have a parking surplus, this is what you can send it on, and the critical bit I think is right at the end, meeting all or any part of the cost of the doing by the authority in the area of anything which facilitates the implementation of the London Transport Strategy. So that's obviously London, but can't remember if there's one which relates to the rest of the country. hope so. Somebody hopefully can answer that. Control parking zones. So hopefully we'll get onto a few more pictures now. So we heard a lot about these. There are lots of benefits for controlled parking, which are very much about reducing car trips, but also making streets much safer. These are some things that we think should happen, but I'm just going to give you some visuals because there's been a lot of words. So this is where before and after controlled parking was brought in. So this was a place which it's quite near to stations, so it was being used, and obviously you've got cars parked there and access gates as well, so emergency access gates, so really bad. So this is about, you know, restricting parking. Councils should publish an accurate and up-to-date audit, should adopt ambitious targets and incentives for reduction in the amount of space dedicated to parking. They should have simple web publicised mechanisms where space can be switched to sustainable uses, and they should publish an assessment of parking at all council-run workplaces. So these are things that we need to think about. Councils should reduce the supply of short-stay parking, should remove short-stay parking in high access areas, should consider introducing a workplace parking levy, and the minimum charge for short-stay parking should be at least the cost of an equal zone. We've done that one, sorry. It's my ADHD that I've just diagnosed myself with, trying to get things organised in my head, sometimes struggle with. So anyway, moving on to council estates. So what we often see in housing estates is that parking is not controlled, and so parking just happens pretty much everywhere. So this means that, you know, that it's not restricted to one space. It doesn't make for a nice environment, and people park on pavements. Pavement parking is obviously a complete disaster that should end immediately. It has nothing to do with the road user hierarchy, and it's just just shocking that it's happening at all, really. Parking and accessibility. So accessibility is kind of goes beyond the issue of blue badge parking, but obviously that is incredibly important. These are some things that we say in the parking assessment tool, or the parking action tool, about what we feel that council should be doing. And mostly on accessibility, we kind of feel that, you know, you need to be thinking about other things than blue badge parking. So for instance, curbside space being used to maximise accessibility for people and non-drivers. So using curbside to keep pavements clutter free, and also your crossover policies. So crossovers are a real problem. So front garden parking and private land is an issue for lots of reasons, but from the active travel point of view, it can block pavements as well. So I've seen this a lot more on Twitter now. I don't know if you are, maybe I'm just following the parking people, but where pavement parking essentially blocks the footway. And also I found this quote from someone on Twitter, which could well be one of somebody here, I don't know, but it says, pushing someone in a wheelchair for a couple of months this summer, I found conventional drive crossovers a real problem. It was a real effort to keep in a straight line. So yeah, so you've got an accessibility issue, and it's increasing danger on the footway. Tackling front garden park is a really complex issue, and relates to crossover policy. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail there, but you can come back to it if you want. This is forecourt parking, so similar issue. You're just blocking areas for pedestrians, and the only real way to control this is by restricting crossovers. But I haven't found a way to talk about for councils to restrict forecourt parking, because it's private land. It's impossible. They can restrict the route onto that land, but often that's difficult as well. So public sector employers, and this is a primary school in Hackney where they've kind of carved out a bit of the playground for everyone to park in, and it just kind of feels like very wrong that the council isn't saying, actually, you know, we want to encourage you to not drive to work, so that, you know, introduce some kind of permit system so that the school actually is clear that, you know, only a certain number of teachers or whatever it is should be able to have a permit for parking, driving to school and driving to work and parking. Improving the economy, the public realm, and supporting the local economy. So this is very related. I find this very related to active travel because it really is just about making the streets nicer places. And this is an example of a before and after on a street, and just very much nicer place to be in, to be walking around, to be hanging around in. That's your kind of public realm and historic settings. Historic settings frequently completely ruined by parking. This is obviously the links between the pedestrian pound and parking. So making clear that actually if areas are nice and don't have lots of cars parked, that actually is good for business and not as often thought very bad for business. Obviously you can also create, and this is you know, the big parklet movement, and I'm sure you've talked about this too. The parklet and streetery movement is about reallocating space to enable businesses to have space to improve their custom. This was a fantastic set of before and afters I found of town centre improvements where parking had given way to other things. So you can have a look through that. I just want to quickly talk about pedestrians and safety. Just looking at the time, can't see that. So junctions should be clear of parking, double yellow lines for a minimum of 10 metres. More recently, I've been talking about the need for informal crossings. So often what we see is a whole street that is parking from one end to the other, and it could be a very long street. So it could be, you know, a 200-metre street, and there is literally no gap in the parking. And that makes it very difficult. Obviously, if you're in a wheelchair, you have to go a whole way to one end and turn, you know, just across the road. So what we're talking about is informal crossing. So you would have a gap in parking, which is the length of two car parking spaces. So roughly 10-metre stretch of road where there is no parking, where there is a double yellow line and a drop curb. And you could add a tree or some greenery or something as well to make it. Obviously, that would need to be on either side of the road. And that has the added benefit of slightly restricting parking a bit as well. This again is the safety issue. So here, yellow lines have been used to make this road much safer, making visual lines, sight lines much better. That's outside. You can see the zigzags outside that school there on the right. That's in, I think that was in Southwark. And my favourite subject, which is keeping pavements clear, which is really where the links to active travel come in most closely, I think. So this is one of my favourite pictures about trees. So why are we still dumping trees on pavements? We need to put them on build-outs in roads. On the right, I've finally found an image of where they built around a tree. So they built the pavement out around the tree. Interestingly, they've still got parking on the left there, but there is an answer. You know, you don't have to cut the tree down, is what I mean. You can build around it. So you know, that picture on the left, I don't know anybody in a wheelchair or is going to get through that. So what do? It's just you know, it's just shocking, really. Street clutter, it's just absolutely everywhere, and I was interested in that previous presentation where we had a little parking sign on the wall, which I think can be done in certain circumstances, but mostly, of course, what happens is a signpost is dumped onto the pavement and thereby creating yet more clutter. I did find this one example I think it was in Lewisham, where they had managed to put the parking sign slightly more discreetly and slightly less in the way against the garden wall. Electric vehicle charging, deep sigh. So yeah, frequently being dumped on the pavement when it could just be taking space from parking and on the carriageway. Could be and should be, I should say. There's bins on the streets. I mean, really does my head in. This you know, there is another, the picture here is in Brighton. So, you know, pavement clutter is such a massive issue for pedestrians that, you know, I don't understand why we're able to even put bins on the pavement anymore. It's kind of shocking. And there are answers. We just got a need to want to find them. So that's your kind of using space for green infrastructure. So that's our parklet. This is from Hackney on a road called Crossway, where they're putting in the rain gardens. That's a before and after there. This is the whole street that's been turned into a park, obviously, thereby removing some parking too. This is obviously a cycle hanger, very familiar. But we've also now got need space for dockless bikes, but also not the secure cycle parking that you would perhaps want at your house, but space for parking your bike when you go to the shops or whatever. That's also needed. So that's also a little bit of space, nicely bookended there with a tree in that example. And here's the West Bank in Hackney, where they took out one side of parking to put in a protected cycle lane with double yellow lines. So there's your more links with active travel there. Buses. So, you know, why on earth we allow parking where we're in bus routes, I don't know, but that's got to go. And also we can create space for car share, shared mobility infrastructure generally. So yeah, so the most recent parking action tool we've launched with Living Streets and Possible, you can find it. We're calling for 25% of curbside to be reallocated to other uses, as Lambeth Council have promised to do. I'm sure you've seen their curbside strategy. Obviously, it's not just about parking. Loads of other things we need to do. Lots of those we talk about as part of the Healthy Streets scorecard. One thing that I've talked about more recently is number of lanes, and I, you know, have a couple of examples here. 9 lanes road width in Kensington and Chelsea. That's central London. 6 lanes in Adelaide Road and Camden. It's just, you know, it's just not okay in the middle of London. Yeah, but parking is key. It's one of the most important tools available to local authorities. It's not being used enough. We need councils to review policy, identify urgent action. They can use our parking assessment tool, which I've put the link to there. So that's just a recap on why it's time for change. But what can councils do right now? Control parking, treat housing estates the same, more double yellow lines for safety, reallocate space, and pavement parking, control and reduce parking in council workplaces, including schools, and only permit new housing development if it is appropriately high density and has a low ratio of parking spaces to household. Yeah, so that's it.
Alice, thank you so much. That was actually a huge round of applause deserved from everybody, because that was an incredible run through of a vast amount and a huge amount of work you've clearly done. It's like, talk about personal investment in a subject. So we've got lots of questions. I'll invite people to put their hands up if they want to ask a question in person, but we've got quite a lot of them input in the chat. One really critical one, Alice, that you might want to do straight off the bat is the classic. Now, you and I have talked about this briefly before we started, because I understand CPRE, but somebody's asked, why is CPRE involved in urban parking policies? What's that all about? So do you want to crack that one first for us?
Yeah, so CPRE London, you know, we campaign to protect the countryside, but as you saw in that example, if you don't have sustainable patterns of development, by which I mean containing sprawl, containing urban sprawl, you end up with car dependent, low density car dependent development in countryside, which can't support buses, 2 cars per household, and yeah, you've lost your countryside. So it couldn't be, the link couldn't be clearer to me. You know, Stevenage, surface car parks, urban fringe development, in nearby Hertfordshire countryside. Which one do we need to do? And it seems very clear to me that we need to be, rethinking our urban centres instead of them being car parks, and building out into our countryside.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alice. You've nailed that one. So now we all know the CPRE cares about urbanism. So I'm going to go to David in just a minute for your question, David. But to be fair on Mark Strong, because he's on a train and it's quite busy and he can't ask his question, he wanted to know if you've got a really good riposte for that time, particularly when you talk to politicians about parking policy and they say that controlled parking penalises the poor. Have you got a perfect comeback line for that?
I think that does depend where you are, doesn't it? So I would say actually most people, but it's rich people own cars more than poorer people. It's quite a simple one. In areas where car ownership is very low, so below 50% of households, then I would say, well, that's still 50%. The majority of people don't own a car, so that seems fairly straightforward. In other areas, I would say, well, you don't have to charge loads of money. The key is getting it restricted. So if you feel like you need to introduce controlled parking at a low charge, then that's better than nothing. That's what I would say.
Thanks, Alice. Okay, so I'll read out a couple more questions in a minute that we've got in the chat. But David, do you want to come in with your question? Or
yes.
point?
Thanks, Steve. Yes, I'm in the London Borough of Brent, and we in the London Cycling Campaign local group have been telling the council for years that they need to introduce CPZs all over the borough, and they have no policy on this. And their policy is that they introduce them where there is demand from the residents. So there has to be, first of all, be some sort of petition from residents, and then you do a consultation, which they treat as a referendum, and they will introduce them if that comes out in favour. But one problem in a lot of the outer suburbs is you have a very large number of people parking business vehicles on the streets. They're sole traders parking their trucks, vans, and all kinds of other sundry commercial equipment on the street. And that can't be prevented by the local authority because it's all under 3.5 tons weight. And those people are never going to vote for controlled parking on their streets. So this just drives a coach and horses through all the green aspirations of the council, because with their policy, they have no way to control parking over large parts of the borough. Is there any other arguments which we can use? Is there any other kind of pressure we can put on the council to have a different policy?
Yeah, I think literally everything I've just said. I mean, everything. If they have got a climate, have they declared a climate emergency? Do they have targets to reduce in London? They have targets to reduce car trips. They have air quality problems. They have all of those problems. Literally everything goes back to parking controls. So, I think it's just about banging on about it a lot, getting a lot of other people to bang on about it a lot, educating, basically. I mean, I really don't think that it's been, we don't talk about parking enough. Hashtag we need to talk about parking. I mean, we do need to talk about parking, and it really is important, but perhaps people don't realise quite how important it is and fundamental to, to getting that mode shift that we want. So I don't know if that answers that, but I just think you've got to kind of get a coalition of people talking about it, and that is why we created the Parking Action Plan tool, because we know that we need councils to understand and take action. And so we wanted to give local campaigners kind of means to start to, really have a go at their council about it, to talk to them about it, or just educate.
Thanks, Alice. Now, I couldn't agree with you more. Hashtag we need to talk about parking. We can all go away with that. And you're so right. I mean, I must have been working on transport issues here in Manchester for a very long time, and we've come at it from so many different angles, but we just never talk about parking. And you're dead right, it's what generates so much of this problem. So Adam, I've got you next, and then I'll come to you, Matthew.
Yeah, this is just a follow-up for David. Baines had that, Bath and North East Somerset had that exact problem, where if they tried to get a residence parking zone in or CPZ in, it would get voted out by effectively group think around it, because basically one area was suffering from it. So as long as those suffered, everybody else was fine. And so what they now did, they granularized it a lot smaller. And so individual streets could make a decision on whether or not they wanted it. And if the ones next door didn't want it, fine, they kept it, they didn't get it, but those on that street got it. And that completely changed the dynamic. And I think that's being used. I'm not sure one of the boroughs in London did that, where they said, and we won't come back in 2 years' time. So the streets next door got their residence parking zone, and then all the parking went onto the next door one. And within, I think, 3-4 years, the whole borough was covered in residence parking zone. So at the moment, what I'd say is that your policy that is a problem at the council, where they got too broader residence parking, or they say it has to be a broad area. No, make it a street at a time, and you'll win the war in about 3 years.
I think that's really helpful. And the other thing that I should have said is that councils will often say, oh, 50% of householders, but that is on the assumption that they're talking to car owners. And it's like, well, have you actually looked at the people who are responding to this? And of course, no one who doesn't have a car is going to respond. So it's fantastically unfair. So, you know, they need to change that policy. And I've heard so many times that councils have these policies where it's basically a referendum, blah, blah, blah. And they say, oh, it's, you know, it's illegal to do it differently. And I asked John Burke that question once, and he said, no, it's not illegal. They've just made that policy. And it is something to do with some obscure bit of legislation, which I'm trying to get to the bottom of, and I think I might have found recently, which is interpretable in a number of different ways. But yeah, basically the answer is you do not have to have that policy as a council, and they need to change it, and they can do that on the basis of pollution, of climate change, of all kinds of things.
Brilliant, thanks, Alice. Right, I'm going to come to what we might do, Alice, is just take Matthew and Simon together and then give you a last moment to round up, because I'm finishing at 6:15. But before we come to you two, Pearl, I noticed, Pearl, you've had a number of questions in the chat. Did you want to come off mute and ask that directly before I go to Matthew and Simon?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Okay. Off you go.
Yeah, I was just listening to a podcast with Donald Shoup the other day, A War on Cars, from a few months ago. And he just had, I didn't really agree with him, but he had this idea that you can have good parking policy, full stop. And I think he meant make it easier for people to park. But people say that, you know, what's the best, we just want the best policy. But I wondered whether CPRE has an opinion on whether it can be good full stop, or whether that's always a subjective question.
Okay, thanks, Pearl. So brilliant, the good challenge. And also, Alice, if there's one that's just completely stands out as the perfect policy, that would be good to know if you've got an opinion on that. So Matthew and Simon, we'll come to you two first, and then I'm going to let Alice have the last few minutes to round up. So Matthew, over to you first.
Our county council locally a few years ago wanted to widen some pavements on the street, which is very, very heavily used by pedestrians. And unfortunately, there was a lot of fuss about this because it's also quite popular for parking in. It's not controlled parking. Residents have to have a permit, but it fills up with other people parking there, so residents find it hard, and there's businesses in the street. So yeah, there was a lot of challenges there, and there was a public meeting where the MP sort of was hoping to create a lot of political hot air about it and against the council. And it just struck me really that actually what everyone was complaining about at the meeting was essentially parking there. They dressed it up in other ways, but really no one was actually happy with the situation because they couldn't actually park easily because the parking was just too lax and it wasn't well managed. So I think that's quite a difficult issue really. It's how to convince people that there are different, better ways of managing the parking, which might actually benefit them. So I'd like your thoughts on that. Would be interesting.
Brilliant. Thanks, Matthew. I know I can see Alice making lots of notes to come back in this in a minute. So just to make the challenge even harder for you, Alice, we'll go to Simon as well, and then I'll come back to you. Simon.
Not so much a question, just a point very quickly following on from Adam's stuff. So it's Waltham Forest, as ever, doing this kind of stuff. What they do is they do a whole zone at once. They then take any street within the zone that tips over them into the majority. They do those streets and they write to all the neighbouring streets to say, we're about to do street X. In 6 months' time, we'll come back and see if you want a CPZ at that point. Lo and behold, that's how you roll it out super fast. What it does do, though, is it causes this kind of creeping cynicism of, you forced me into voting for a CPZ in my area because now my street is covered in cars, etc., which is just happening in the northern bits of the borough right this very second. But yeah, that's how you roll it out if you really want to roll it out.
Brilliant. Top tip will be on YouTube shortly if you want to direct people to Simon's top tips. Okay, Alice, I'm going to let you come back on all those because there's quite a few points there. So over to you.
Yeah, so just very quickly, yeah. So the parking action tool is effectively a benchmark parking policy for local authorities. That, in our view, is at this moment in time what we think good parking policy looks like. And you need to be challenging your council to think about all of those things. Some councils will be much further along than others. And so, but you've got to start somewhere. So my answer to that kind of leads me to the next one. What do you do when it's really difficult? And it is difficult because it is political. It's just do what you can. You've got to start somewhere. So try to find incremental, do it incrementally. Councillors, you don't need to talk about it, publicly all the time. Clever councils won't kind of do too much talking about it. You do need to talk to your local businesses. Obviously, they need to be able to park and load and all that, but also they need to understand the benefits of getting parking under control and enabling people to arrive and have a nice experience of the space. So that's in central parking. So there's so many different aspects to parking that it's really hard to come up with one particular thing. So I would definitely say look at the parking benchmark. And just try to find the things that can be done rather than the things that will be really difficult to do, because a lot of it will be difficult. But I remember, Simon, we went to meet a councillor in Tower Hamlets, which has literally the lowest car ownership levels in the entire country, and she said to us, you can never do anything about parking here when you're coming up to an election. And I just said, what, even those 70% of householders don't own a car. But she was adamant that nothing could be done. It's extraordinary. So yeah, I kind of get it, but I also think something can be done. And even in Kensington and Chelsea, it's famously don't want to ever do anything about parking as far as what you hear. They are incrementally doing things, particularly around bus lanes and stuff like that. So maybe bus lanes is an easy target in certain areas. Maybe maybe certain things will be easier in some places than others, I guess. So yeah, that's it. Best parking policy is just control parking. Maybe do something nice. Maybe enable people to have parklets or to have streeteries. Do the nice stuff. If you think that just the controlling parking would be too hard. But obviously, controlling parking is very clearly the big win. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Alice. That was very, very wise words. I'm going to wrap us up. I'm struck by one question that was in the chat that I'm just going to flag, although you don't have to come back on it, Alice. Is somebody did ask about reporting on and highlighting the opportunity cost of parking, simply in terms of how much we're squandering and how much we're investing, and particularly for those areas where car owners are even a minority, and you're massively subsidizing their activities. So that was in the chat and I wanted to make sure we didn't lose it. And then Roger, I think your point's well made about CPRE being one of the leaders on better planning, and all of this reminds us yet again that we need to respect planning as an industry and an art form more, because better planning would help sort a lot of this out. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Alice. Thank you to everybody else who's contributed. Thank you for all of your brilliant questions. Really amazing. Next week, I hope you'll join us again. We're going to be focusing on the trip to school, that old chestnut. So school travel will be our subject next week. And Alice, thank you once more, and have a lovely evening, everybody. Take care. Bye.